Howdy, friends, and welcome to The Story Field. This is a podcast where we talk about business, faith, and life in general.
Okay, so here's the deal. We want you to be encouraged. We want you living in hope. This life we live is complex. It's hard at times. At The Story Field, you will find great stories of normal people just like us who will inspire you. Our goal is that you leave encouraged, inspired, and excited to move forward in life. But before we get started, one thing though, if you're listening and you find yourself really hopeless right now, send us an email at hope@thestoryfield.com so we can pray for you. Thanks for joining us today. Let's get started.
So, hey, Storyfield, we are glad you're listening to this interview today. Because really, I do believe that every single person who listens to this interview will have a valuable takeaway, and I believe that. Now, our guest today is John Seidl. John, man, thanks for making time today to share the story and being open and honest. That's why I think it's going to be so impactful.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. So we have a lot to dive into, but here's a brief intro. Now we're going to fill in the gaps later, John, okay? But you're a storyteller. Now, you've written over 6,000 stories. You've helped start a top 50 news site. You've operated in the role as editor in chief of I Am Second, and many people know it's the White Chair films. Just Google I'm Second, look on YouTube, you'll see. You've been head of a special media digital project for Kirk Cameron, and you've worked for some of the biggest names in media like Glenn Beck, Kirk Cameron, Chip and Joanna Gaines. So, man, that's awesome. Like, talk about kind of an influence that you've had. Now, most recently, you have authored and released a book in 2021 called Finding Rest, Navigating the Valleys of Anxiety, Faith, and Life. So it became almost instantly an Amazon bestseller, shot up to number 17, released on Amazon, and became one of the top 100 bestsellers of all on Amazon. Man, that's incredible. Good timing?
Yeah, right. You know, I signed the contract for the book in January of 2020, right? And so the publisher's like, "Hey, anxiety's on the rise. We'd love to have this book." I'm like, "Great, let's do it." Little did I know that like almost 2 months to the day later, you know, the whole world shuts down, and now people who didn't have anxiety, didn't have depression, you know, they're just like, holy cow, what is happening to me, right? And so the book couldn't come out soon enough, right? So, you know, it takes a little bit to write a book and get it through all the publishing channels and whatnot. So it came out fall of 2021. And then one of the reasons that we're talking today is I just released a companion workbook that really allows people, hey, you loved the book, it was great. Maybe you highlighted and made notes. Now here's a chance to go deeper, right? And so I call it an invitation to go deeper. And so, yeah, you're right. It could not have come at a better time, and the reaction is just astounding.
That's amazing, man. That's super amazing. Now, I want to mention too, you also were the founder and owner of the Veritas Creative. It's a digital media consulting and content creation firm. So we can't just skip over that. I mean, that's all in the mix. That's all part of your story. So, man, I think people would hate me if I didn't just dive into your story and the book and battling with anxiety and OCD first. So Forgive me. I want to hit that first, and then let's get into, your business and some other things as well. But start us off at your story. Like, give us your childhood, kind of how'd you get to Texas from Wisconsin, that type of thing. And then let's get into anxiety and the book and see if we can really encourage people today.
So, you know, growing up, I always knew there was something different about me. And so, like you mentioned, I grew up in small town Wisconsin, town of about 34,000. And I just, you know, I was always kind of on edge, or there was always things I couldn't stop thinking about, right? I remember kind of my first OCD episode happened when I was about 12. But I just thought, hey, that's just how I am, right? I'm a little high strung, little wound, a little tight, you know, whatever the cliches you want to put in there. And so from Wisconsin, I went to New York City for college, and you know, talk about going to the one place where if you have undiagnosed anxiety and OCD, where it's really going to be heightened. is New York City, right? And so went there, I went there thinking like I was big into politics and stuff as a high schooler. I was like, I'm going to be the next press secretary of the United States, right? That was my goal. And luckily God saved me from that. And while I was in college, I just realized, hey, I kind of have this ability to write. And I had some great professors who called that out at me, and so I started writing and got internship at a magazine, worked for World Magazine while I was in college, and found my wife, right? Got married, and we moved to Denver for a year, moved back to New York City, and eventually my job moved me down to Dallas, right? Everything's kind of, you live in the area, and for your listeners who don't, I mean, it's like everything's moving down to the Dallas area, right? And so the news organization I was working for at the time moved me down here. And so what's interesting though is still at that time I was undiagnosed, and it really started wreaking havoc on my marriage because the slightest little thing would set me off, right? And set me off in the sense of like, not like into a fist punching the wall tantrum or something like that, but like I just couldn't stop thinking about something for days and sometimes weeks. And it would ruin weeks. It would ruin weekends. And so one weekend in particular, my wife and I are living in a loft in downtown Dallas. It's like an old Sears warehouse. And we're like, hey, we're going to explore the city. We're going to walk around downtown Dallas. There's a coffee shop in the bottom of these lofts. And I go to my wife, hey, I'm going to run to the bathroom. You get the coffee. By the way, remember, sweet and low, not Splenda. See, I hate sweet and low, or excuse me, I hate Splenda. I think it like makes stuff taste like dirty sock water. And so I come back from the bathroom. She hands me my coffee. So excited. I take a sip and I almost do like one of those classic spit takes, like the, kind of thing. And it set me off. I'm like, what? I gave you one job, Yeah. And she's like, listen, I didn't put it in there. I told them to put sweet and low, but they put Splenda, and that ruined our weekend. I could not stop thinking about that. Now, to a quote unquote normal person, that sounds ridiculous, right? But to someone who struggles with anxiety and OCD, you're thinking, and there's other stories, right? Like I'd go to the hardware store and I'd run over like something in the road, and I'd be convinced that I had ran someone over, and I'd circle the block just looking for blood and people taking pictures and whatnot. And so finally that weekend, towards the end of the weekend, my wife just broken down crying, and she's like, listen, I'm not going anywhere, but I can't live like this. And she's like, and you can't live like this. We can't live like this. Right. And so when you see the person you love, marriage has a way of refining us and bringing out our blind spots. And so when you see the woman you love just like broken down in front of you, you're like, okay, you're right. Something's off here. And so that's when I scheduled an appointment with the first psychiatrist who had an opening, which, by the way, if you want to figure out if you have anxiety and OCD that's undiagnosed, just have to wait like 2 to 3 weeks before you can get into the psychiatrist.
Yeah.
And so I went in, and, the guy shows up, the doctor comes in, and he's like this really disheveled, like Doc Brown hair, from Back to the Future, which in some ways like gave me some sense of comfort. I'm like, I don't know. I guess I want my psychiatrist to look a little disheveled. And so I tell him, we go through my life, we go through what's going on. And he just kind of looks at me and says, kind of nonchalantly, Mr. Seidl, you have what's called GAD, generalized anxiety disorder, and OCD. And I'll tell you what, Josh, it was one of the most freeing days of my life. People are like, really? And I'm like, yeah, because before that, it was like the lights were off. I was punching in the dark. I knew something was there. I didn't know where it was, though. And then when I got the diagnosis, it's like the lights came on. I knew what was in front of me. I knew where to land my punches. I could create a plan, to fight back. And so I tell people, and this is one of the first early chapters in the book, in the workbook, when we name something, we gain power over it, right? And that's a very biblical idea that Adam was given the job of naming the animals in the garden, and in that job is like he's asserting dominion, right? He's asserting his place in the hierarchy of creation, and it's the same with me. And I think sometimes Christians and non-Christians even, right? Like we just want to stick our head in the sand. pretend like this isn't happening, this isn't going on. And so when we name something, we gain power over it. And that was the day I really started my journey of gaining power over it.
Yeah, that's super interesting because most people may like freak out at that moment, but for you, that was a huge moment of awareness.
Oh,
and
yeah,
that was
absolutely.
actually really helpful.
Absolutely. Right. And I've heard some people, I've never had cancer, but it's like if you're sick, right, and you're, maybe you're throwing up all over the place or you have no energy, it's like if you go to the doctor and like, hey, guess what, you have lupus, right, or you have ALS, it's like, well, hey, at least now right? Before you were just like, what is going on? Now now you can create a plan of attack.
Huh. So back up a minute, and we're gonna jump back and forth on your timeline. Yeah. You mentioned, we briefed over a lot of storytelling. You've written a ton of stories. Did you know going into college that was something you were interested in? You mentioned there was a professor or two who pointed that out. Speak to that professor as far as like, keep doing that. Look what's happened.
Yeah,
so was there one in particular that you had in mind?
One in particular, his name was Dr. Ethan Campbell. He's still at my alma mater. He lives in Brooklyn. And so here's the funny thing, how it happened. So I didn't go into college, thinking I would be a writer, but I went to a Christian liberal arts college that emphasized the fact that everyone has to be able to have kind of a baseline of good writing skills, right? So they emphasize that in general in their curriculum. And so it was in my college writing 1 class, which I think in some colleges would be like, a junior level class. And I had to do a descriptive essay. And the prompt was like, you write it about whatever you want, like go walk in the city, whatever you want. And so I wrote this essay about the differences between living in New York City and growing up in Wisconsin. Right?
Oh, yeah, that was a big difference.
Yeah.
From a small town.
Yeah. And so, I turned it in. I was obviously proud of it, but I turned it in. My professor's like, hey, just so you know, like, this is really good. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah, like you might want to think about like really pressing into this. And I'm like, oh, okay. So from there, I took that essay. I submitted it to my local newspaper in Wisconsin and said, hey, I know you guys do guest op-eds at times. Like, I'm a college student, from here that lives in New York City. Would you be interested in running this? And they're like, this is great. We love this. And so like it starts stacking. You're like, oh, okay. I guess maybe this is kind of a talent that I have. And then from there, became an editor of the college newspaper and had a weekly column, and then was encouraged. Our provost at the time was the editor-in-chief of World Magazine. And he started seeing my writing in the college newspaper. He's like, hey, I think you should apply for our internship program. Okay. Applied for the internship program. It was like a summer program where they sent me out and I got to write about these incredible faith-based nonprofits. And the stories so it was me and like 4 other interns. The stories that we wrote were the final judging criteria for this really big grant that they would get. And my story helped secure the grant for this awesome kind of like halfway house for women in the Memphis area. People don't realize, but Memphis is the home to FedEx. And one of the bad byproducts of that is around that area has sprung up a lot of sex work, sex trafficking, strip clubs, all that kind of stuff, because these people are going in and out of work 24/7, right? And so I got to meet these women. I got to hear their stories. I got to write about them. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, okay, if and that was the first taste I got of the fact that like my writing can really help and affect other people. Like, before that, it was like, okay, I'm writing about, I'm writing college essays or I'm writing stuff in the college newspaper. But this was like, okay. And so that's where I was like, I don't necessarily just want to be a nuts and bolts news reporter. I want to tell stories, and there's a difference. And so when I was managing a news organization, I would tell all my writers, listen, I don't want you to write articles. I want you to tell stories. And so that was kind of my impetus into storytelling. And so when I was at the news organization, I'm second in Kirk. I think, I got to update that. I got to update that stat because it says I've written over 6,000 stories. I think by now it's probably over, 8, 9, maybe even 10,000.
That's amazing. So. No, that's cool. I appreciate that, Professor, pointing that out. And I love the Lord's involvement in guiding you to where you're at through other people and through connecting your dot to the internship, to seeing that your story is making a difference. That's just pretty cool.
And here's what's interesting, right? We're telling stories, so I'll tell you this one. So I got that internship between the summer of my junior and senior year in college. Like I said, grew up in Wisconsin. I always wanted to like be on a ranch, like with horses. I grew up with a horse, And so that summer I had two opportunities. It's the quintessential like Robert Frost, two roads diverged in a yellow wood. And so I had the opportunity to travel the country, write stories, or I had another job offer to go work on a dude ranch in Colorado with no cell phone signal and be a wrangler. And I like it came down. I'm like, what do I do? What do I do? I really want to ride horses all day. And I was like, no, the Lord was like, you really need to do the writing. And I was like, okay. And look, I mean, now it's what I do for a living.
Isn't that funny too? You had that choice. Like he put those in front of you to choose. Like, are you going to choose you or me? Like the king, what I have for you, kingdom or like the world? That's pretty cool. Okay. Yep. So now you're back. Fast forward. Let's go back to, you've been to the therapist. Were you meeting with him or her often?
So I went to
the next steps on that.
Yeah, I went to a psychiatrist first. And so this is what I tell people, like because a psychiatrist in the mental health world, a psychiatrist is a MD. They're a doctor, so they can prescribe medication, which I would love to talk about going forward too. And so I went to him initially to get on some medication to help me. And then from there, psychiatrists, they're not therapists, right? Like they're just very nuts and bolts. And so he was like, hey, now you need to go to a counselor, a therapist. And so then from there, I found a Christian counselor that I started meeting with regularly, probably for about a year. And because there was a lot to unwind, right? I mean, when you start connecting the dots and you're like, oh, for example, I quit football when I was a sophomore in high school. I was the MVP of the team the year before, freshman year. But in fall minicamp, I tore my MCL and I didn't have to have surgery. So I just needed like a few weeks of recovery time. And I was like, I got back and I had so much anxiety about making the team, all the people that, I'm out for 3 weeks and now they've all, they've learned the system. I was a linebacker. They learned the defensive system and like, they're all ahead of me. And it looks like the coaches are favoring them. And I didn't know what to do with that. Right. And so I was just like, all right, I'm out. Right. And so, looking back, it was like in talking with my therapist, like that was like, I had an anxiety attack and in that moment, I was like, it's a fight or flight response. And I flew. Right. I chose flight. And so you start looking back and unpacking these things. You're like, oh, wow. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, man. So what year was that approximately? Because I want to just ramp up to the book too.
When I was in the high school time?
No. Like when you were meeting with a therapist and kind of.
Oh, so that was about 2014.
Okay.
2014.
Now I did run across something in your book where it was you kind of really wrote an article that talked about like your condition while you're at I Am Second. So this was all before that? Yeah,
exactly. And so 2016, I find myself at I Am Second. And as editor in chief, one of my roles was, you talked about the White Chair films and the films come out, let's say every month or every 2 months. But films are costly to make, right? And so they brought me on to say, hey, can you help us create basically a writing framework, a writing engine, a writing schedule? Can you, hire writers and contributors so that, we know that when we release a film, it's a peak, right? But in between, there's these valleys. And we know that, maybe writing's never going to be as important as the films, but we just like to lower out those valleys, And so I was sitting in my office one day, and we needed an article for the week, like a last article of the week or something like that. And I was like, okay, like all my writers were either tied up or my contributors were busy or couldn't do it. So I was like, okay, I call it putting on the jersey. I have to put on the jersey and do this. And so I sat down, I closed my door, and I'm like, all right, so what do I write about? And I just kind of had that that soft urging, like, you need to tell, and this was what I got. You need to tell the world your secret. And see, up until then, even though I've been diagnosed on medication for a couple of years, I wasn't really vocal about it. Right. And I think especially because, and again, I'll tease this again, the stigma that people, and especially the church, have on taking medication. I knew it was helping me. Right. But I also grew up in a faith tradition that said, hey, if you just have more faith, if you just pray more, if you repent of unrepentant sins that you don't even know you commit, like then everything will be fine, right? So I just had a reticence to talking about it publicly. But man, I just kept getting that prompting. You need to tell the world your secret. So I literally sat down and in probably an hour knocked out this article called "It's Time to Tell the World My Secret," and it just skyrocketed on the I Am Second website. I just started getting flooded with messages from Facebook and Instagram and just like everything about, wow, like, thank you. I've been suffering in silence for a long time. I can't really talk to my parents or my pastor or whoever about it because I'm just told I need to have more faith. And so once I wrote that story and talked about my own story there, it really became obvious that, like, this is something that I need to make part of my platform, if you will. Like, I'm going to be talking about this for the rest of my life. It's that important.
Hey, y'all. I just want to make an observation. When I see someone going through a legal situation, it seems like there are way too many unknowns. Well, the Allen firm provides legal guidance so that you can make a great decision, come to a resolution, and be at peace. For more information about the Allen firm, visit allenlawfirm.com.
Do you still have a link to the article, or do you still have it readily available?
I do.
Okay,
actually.
we may have to attach that to show notes. I would love to release that.
Yeah. I'll find that for you and send it.
So once that happened, lead up to, at what point did you know you were supposed to turn this into a book? Did the Lord kind of start navigating you and impressing that upon you?
Here's what's funny, right? And I'm actually even just realizing this a little bit more as we're talking is, I knew I always wanted to write a book. In fact, I'll go back to that professor I was talking about, Dr. Ethan Campbell in college. And as part of my liberal arts degree, we're required to do a senior thesis, basically. Pick a topic, explore it. It's kind of your magnum opus of your time at the college. And I went to this professor and I said, I don't want to do a senior thesis. I said, I want to write a book. And what was really cool is he's like, well, we've never done that at the school. And he goes, writing a book takes a long time. I said, okay, so what could we do? He goes, how about this? I will fight for you with the powers that be at the college and get approved that you will write basically a full outline of a book in like the first 3 chapters. And so he fought for that. And it was the first time in the college's history that they ever budged on the idea of, not doing a traditional senior thesis. And so I had that in the back of my mind, right? And the book that I had written was actually about my mom. My mom's a entrepreneur. She just had a lot of ups and downs in her own life and fighting for, going through divorce and just all that stuff. And so the book that I was going to write was going to be about her, right? And when I wrote this article a couple years later, I had I guess it was actually when I was working for Kirk. So I just started working for Kirk, and I started hosting Kirk's podcast. So part of the digital media business that we created was a podcast, a subscription podcast. And so I got to interview a lot of great, awesome people. And I just get this weird email one day. It's like, hey, my name is, I'm trying to remember. Let's call her Hannah. She's like, I'm Hannah. I'm from Hachette, which is one of the big publishers. And she's like, I was looking for a podcast to get my author on that we just published a book. And she goes, and then I found Kirk's podcast. I found you. And I started reading some of your stuff. And she's like, have you ever considered writing a book? And I said,
oh, wow.
I said, I mean, I guess I always wanted to write a book. I never, but I haven't thought about writing one on anxiety. She goes, listen, if I help you find an agent, would you be interested? And I said, I mean, absolutely. Right. And so here's the funny thing, right, is as I look back in my life, some of the biggest monumental moments were other people calling stuff out in me that I didn't see. Right. So you have the professor that says, hey, I think you're kind of good at this writing thing. You should pursue it. And have that book publisher that says, hey, have you ever considered writing a book on this subject? Because you really need to. Right. And so that's how I got an agent, and that was in maybe like 2018. And so again, 2 years later, it's a long process, right? I mean, listen,
walk us through that a little bit. I want to know about that.
There's self-publishing, right? And so some people are like, well, why did you wait so long? Like, why didn't you just self-publish? And so, I'll just, let people see how the sausage is made a little bit. But because there's a certain credibility that comes with because it takes so long, because there's so many layers and levels to getting a book deal and an agent and kind of all that stuff, there is a certain amount of credibility that then comes with when you're quote unquote published author with a publishing house. And so I just felt convicted that like that was the way I was going to go, especially, and you and I talked about this offline, especially knowing that I'm not a counselor. I'm not a pastor. I'm not a clinician, right? I'm just a guy that has anxiety and OCD that wants to talk to you about it, right? And there weren't a lot of books at the time about that, right? There were a lot of the clinical books or the other things. And so I said, you know what? I want to go the traditional publishing route. And so, yeah, it took a total of, probably 2 years from the time that I first got the call from that publishing contact to when the book came out. Maybe even 3 now that I think about it.
So did you, at the time, have you already started your creative company as well?
I hadn't.
Okay, so you were doing that as a full-time job, just cranking it out.
No, I was working Kirk full-time, really.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And writing the book on the side, which, and this is, talk about a great wife, right? And so, because I had this full-time job with Kirk, I was like, when am I going to write? I had a lot of friends from my time in the news business that had written books, and they're like, yeah, I get up at 4 a.m. before work starts, and then I write from 7 to 11 once the kids go to bed. And I'm like, bro,
sir.
I'm in bed by like 9 o'clock. Like I'm an old soul that way, and so I was like, I'm just not interested in that. And so my wife and I devised this plan. She said, okay. I called it the National Guard book writing plan. Like when I do consulting, I tell people this. I'm like, hey, this is how I did it. It's 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, right? So you join the National Guard, you're required to do 1 weekend a month, 2 weekends, 2 weekends, or 2 weeks a year. So I said, works for them. I think that might work for me. So for 1 weekend of every month, I was blessed that my in-laws have a lake house in the Dallas area. It's about an hour and a half away, which is like the perfect, right? It's like if their emergency happens, I can get home, but it's like far enough away where, the kids aren't dropping in and stuff like that. And so from Thursday to Sunday, 1 weekend a month, I would go away and just write, and that would be it. And by the way, I learned something interesting that I learned that I had to start going on Thursdays. Originally it would be Friday, but when you're working full time, you need 12 to 24 hours to decompress and to like switch your mind, right? My buddy calls it switching cost. There's a cost to switching, and you can't just go right from, okay, I'm writing this course for Kirk. Now I'm going to write my own book. You're like, well, it's both writing. Now it's a different mindset, And so, and then for 2 full weeks, 1 weekend, 1 week in the summer, and 1 week about a month or 2 weeks before the manuscript was due, I did full writing weeks. Took off work, took PTO, and so that's how I did it. Cranked it out.
Unstuck Coaches hates it when movement and progress in a person's life or business is stuck, or frozen, or slowed, or just stopped altogether. Well, we have found a solution. Unstuckcoaches.com. They offer a variety of coaching services to get you or your business moving again. Check out Unstuckcoaches.com.
Man, that's so cool, John. Wow. That's an interesting way to think about it, too. I like the National Guard approach. Like, I mean, I could get behind that. That's helpful to take this off and put that on, transition into it, and get after it.
And then there was no anxiety during the week, right? As someone who struggles with anxiety, right? You can always, you could feel like, I'm watching a show on Netflix with my wife, right? Like that's time that we're spending together, going out to dinner. And so you don't feel like, oh my goodness, I have to be writing. I have to be writing, right? You're like, no, I'm going to put that in its proper place on the shelf. Then I'm going to take it off and really be engaged instead of kind of half-mindedly engaged. And so I just found that's what worked for me.
Well, let's help some people. Walk us through some of the book that you feel like you want to talk about as far as, what do you deal with anxiety, depression, and OCD type stuff, or just kind of walk us through what you want to walk us through and see we can help and encourage.
Yeah. And so one thing I'll say, even I'll just define some terms here, is everyone who has OCD has anxiety. Not everyone who has anxiety has OCD, right? So anxiety is kind of the more general umbrella term. And really OCD is a way for you to handle your anxiety. You start doing rituals or stuff to get your mind off of the anxious thoughts, right? And so I think a lot of people are like, okay, so do you excessively wash your hands? No, my wife would probably like me to wash my hands more. Like it manifests itself in different ways. Mine is called intrusive thought OCD, where I get a thought in my head and I just can't get it out. And so, a practical example is before I was diagnosed, it manifested itself in emails. People are like, what? And I would, let's say I got an email from my boss. I would read that email 50 times. Like, oh my gosh, what does that mean? What if? And I call it, by the way, the tyranny of the what if. I talk about this in the book. To me, anxiety is the tyranny of the what if. Your mind goes to what ifs, right? And so I say us anxiety sufferers are the only people who get a paper cut and within 5 minutes we have cancer, right? Because we're like, what if this? Well, what if that? What if that? And you just kind of go down these really bad thought patterns and thought cycles. And so what I tell people is when it comes to anxiety, is it's that overactive fight or flight response, right? And so people are like, well, so how do I know if I have clinical anxiety? And because in the end, we all have anxiety, right? We all have a fight or flight response, right? You get, in Texas here, you're coming up to a yellow light. You're like, should I go? And you go and you're like, oh crap, that thing turned red. And you kind of get that pit in your stomach, right? That's your fight or flight response, right? And in general, it's good. But for people like me, I encounter things like an email from my boss and my fight or flight response kicks in, right? So I have to reread that email 50 times. And so then I would send a response. And then I'd reread that email 50 times. Did I communicate that right? What if he actually really meant this? Did I send that too soon? Do I look desperate? Do I not look desperate enough? Do I not get, like all those things. And so that's how mine manifested itself. And so there's kind of a couple foundational ideas in the book and the workbook. And the first one is your anxiety, your OCD, your depression is not God punishing you. right? That's the tradition I grew up in, right? Anything bad that happened to you that you didn't want to happen to you was a result of, you drinking too much on the weekend or saying a curse word or not repenting or not being kind or not praying enough, not having enough faith. And, that really, in college, I really kind of started, even though I was undiagnosed, I just started looking at the book of Job, and the book of Job just like completely shatters that idea. Right. And so if you look at the book of Job, a lot of people know the story, right? God and the devil are talking. The devil's like, hey, you mind if I like do some stuff to your servant Job? And God's like, nah, go ahead, watch. He won't curse me. But that's actually not how the story goes. And people don't realize this. The book of Job opens with the devil and God talking. And it's God who brings up Job to the devil. A lot of people miss that. They just kind of feel, the devil goes to God, ask God if he can hurt Job. And God says, yes. No. God goes, have you considered my servant Job? And so wait a second. And so what that does is it kind of leads me to the second foundational point of what I call a proper theology of suffering is God will allow us to go through difficulties to refine us and to redefine us. Right. And that's what you see in the book of Job. He allows Job to go through this. He allows this stuff to be taken away for the health issues to occur. And that should be a comfort to us that God has a bigger plan and purpose, or a bigger plan and purpose in place. Excuse me. And so then people are like, yeah, exactly. Right. Like Job got so much more stuff. Again, you missed the point. The point was not like, if you look at the end of Job, the part about Job, like getting double riches and like everything back, it's like, it's seriously like almost like a footnote at the end of Job, right? It's like, oh, and by the way, right? The point of all of that was Job got more of God, right? Like his relationship to God got so much deeper and better, right? And so that's the point, right, of our struggles when we talk about refining and redefining us, right? We get more of God. C.S. Lewis, I have a book from him in the background of my office, but I love C.S. Lewis. And he talks about how pain is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And the truth is, you and I are very hard of hearing, right? Like,
yeah, for sure. No, I can relate to that. And actually that kind of part of your book too, when I was breezing through it, really jumped out at me because that's a big deal. And I was going to ask you that, like, why does God allow us to go through those struggles? And you said one, because it points us back to him.
Yeah.
And talk about how he gets glory from that and how it helps us as well.
Right. So I tell people like it's for our good and his glory. So you look at the book of Job, but then you fast forward to Paul, right? And so, there's that classic verse about Paul having the thorn in his flesh. And people argue like, was that a physical thorn? Was it a spiritual thorn? And I say, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever it was, right? Because the key words are to keep me from being conceited, right? That's how Paul starts that verse. To keep me from being conceited, a thorn was given to me, a tormentor, right? And then he ends it by talking about how that brings God glory, right? And so I think what you see in Paul that echoes what you see in Job is this idea that our struggles, because they bring us closer to God, they are for our good. And then the closer we are to God, the more glory we bring him, right? Look at Job, right? Look at Paul, right? And you talk about for Paul's good, I think people skip over that first part, to keep me from being conceited. Like, I think what Paul is saying there is like, guys, I'm probably a really cocky person, right? I'm probably really prideful, right? Think about it. Like Paul, like Jesus appears to him on the road. He's like, he's preaching in front of people. So he says, to keep me from being conceited. So for Paul's good, to keep him from the sin of pride, he was given a thorn in his flesh. And that actually goes real nicely into this next foundational point, which is, listen, my anxiety, my OCD, my depression are both a physical issue and a spiritual issue. See, the church has historically treated it only as a spiritual issue. The world historically treats it only as a physical issue, but it's a both and, right? And so I think what people need to hear and understand is like, I know that there are sin issues in my heart, right? That contribute to my anxiety and OCD. And it comes down to one word: pride, just like Paul was talking about, right? Because in my pride, I want to control everything. I want to know everything. I want to be able to understand at every moment what's going on, right? That's pride, right? And so God allows me to have my own thorn in my flesh, my thorn in my brain that says, no, you can't control everything. Look what happens, John, when you try to control everything. It goes haywire, right? Like me trying to control everything, just ask my wife, ends very badly, right? And so that's why I tell people, listen, I pray every day that God would take this away from me. And he can, right? He is powerful. He does miracles. He hasn't. So then what? And it's that question, the so then what, that is really the foundation for the book.
God, I know I'm reminded of and my grace is sufficient, with you and your weakness. But it's really interesting that suffering, regardless of what it is, brings us closer to God, which makes us look more like him, which, gives him glory. But I've always have wrestled through, like, what does that look like? Because there's the whole God with us part of it as well. So it's like he allows this stuff and we get closer to him, but also he walks us through it. Do you deal with any of that, or have you thought about any of that?
Yeah. And listen, and I don't try to cop out, but I tell people, like, there at some point there is a mystery to our faith, right? And so what I can do is, and I talk about that proper theology of suffering. In the end, the simplest way to put it is, and there was a pastor in Arizona that said this, right? And I can never remember his name, so I'm not pretending this is my phrase, but that we need to get to a point where we don't judge God by our circumstances, but we judge our circumstances by who we know God is. And who do we know God is? Through faith, by what he says in his word, right? And so, listen, I know that's not something easy to stomach, like when in some of the most difficult times. But here's what I can say. Because God allowed me to go through my mental health crisis, right? And because he was with me, because of the truths that he revealed to me. When in 2018, I'm driving to a movie, I get a call from my oldest sister, frantic, bawling, crying, hyperventilating, and through tears and whatever, learned that my other sister was just killed in a head-on collision on the interstate. No fault of her own, was driving, getting a car part. Someone crossed the center line, hit her head on, killed instantly. Fast forward 2 years later, middle of COVID, my stepdad, one of the most healthiest people you can imagine, stroke in his brainstem, collapses, never wakes up, dies 2 days later on Easter, right? But because of the refining and the redefining that happened through my mental health crisis, I became a rock to my family during both of those times, right? And so like I never would have. I mean, I saw some immediate benefits to that God was working in going through my mental health crisis. I never would have imagined that in the span of 2 years, that going through that in his grace would allow me then to speak into the lives of my family and people at the funerals and be in the room when my stepdad, took his last breath and be able to comfort my mom in a way that I never would have. Right. And so I'm not pretending that you will see the immediate benefits, right? It's not like, hey, my husband cheated on me and left me. You're telling me that God is good in that. What I will say is he is, right? You may not see the fruit or the refining or the redefining that you're going through, the reason why, maybe until 5, 10, 20 years down the road. But I can tell you he is.
Yeah, I can testify to the same thing, John. I mean, I went through, it might have been close to 7 years of same thing, anxiety, very deep depression, that type of thing. And then I look back now and what the Lord did through it. He completely changed my life and everybody around me through it. Enough to where you would look back and I say, that was terrible, and I'm glad that happened to me because look where he's brought me, both spiritually, mentally, everything now. It's amazing.
I'll tell you what, my favorite hymn is "It Is Well With My Soul," and I go into depth of in the story of that hymn in the workbook. And maybe some of you have heard it, maybe some of you have not, but it's a guy named Horatio, and Horatio was a really successful businessman in Chicago. Lost his business during the Great Chicago Fire. Lost a child to I think it was like diphtheria or something. And he was going over to England to help the great evangelist D.L. Moody. Something happened at his business. He couldn't go, but he sent his wife and 2 daughters ahead. And he's like, I'll meet you in a week. They go over, they get caught in a storm, and the kids they die, right? And "It Is Well With My Soul" was written as Horatio was going over literally the exact spot where the ship went down. The captain said, hey, just want to let you know, like, this is the spot. He leans over the deck. He looks into the depths and the abyss of the ocean and writes, "It is well with my soul." If that isn't something, like, it gives me goosebumps, right?
Yeah, me too.
Because how many of us, you've been there, I've been there, have looked into the depths, the abyss of our mental health, of deaths in the family, of whatever the junk is, and not been able to say, "It is well with my soul." What I want to get to, and it's still a work in progress for me, right, is looking into the depths of it and saying, "It is well with my soul." That's a proper theology of suffering.
Oh, man. Okay, you cover 14 different truths in your book. Is there any of those you want to talk about?
Yeah.
That come to mind?
There is. And so the first one I'll talk about it because I teased it a while back is I tell people medication is okay, right? One of the biggest things that I got when I wrote my article for I'm Second, and then in writing the book, the biggest pieces of feedback I've gotten is just how much that it has medication for mental health has been demonized, right? And if you think about it, it just makes no sense, right? It's like we go to the doctor for a broken arm, but we don't go for a broken brain, right? And I tell people this is a spiritual thing. I talked about the pride issues, but it is a physical thing, right? There are synapses that don't fire correctly. There are serotonin levels that are off, and God has offered you a common grace of medication. I even go through the story of how the medication that I take, was invented, right? There is this idea that if we take medication, we have a lack of faith and all of that stuff. And it's just a lie. And the best way I describe it is like this. There's a flood down in like the Houston area, and the waters start rising. There's this guy in his house, and a police cruiser comes up and says, "Hey man, get in. Like, we're going to rescue you." And he goes, No. I'm praying for God to rescue me. Like, I know he can do it. Right. Fast forward, the waters rise, it's up to his chest. A boat comes, and the guy's like, the sheriff's department's like, "Hey, hop in." And he's like, No. I'm praying for God to rescue me. Right. He gets up to the roof, waters rise even more. Helicopter comes. "Sir, get in the helicopter." "No, I'm praying for God to rescue me. I know he can do it." Right? Gets to heaven, asks God, "What happened? I knew that you could rescue me." And God's like, "I sent you a car, a boat, and a helicopter. Like, what more did you want?" Right? Yeah. And so that's like what I tell people is like, medication is that common grace. It's that helicopter. It's that police cruiser. It's that boat, right? And, I talk about pride, the spiritual issue in my heart. It is just as prideful to tell God how he can't help you than it is to say how he can, right? And so again, it's one more sign of wanting to control thing. "Oh, God, you can help me any way you want except by medication." What? That's so backwards, right? And people are like, "Well, I don't want to be on it for my whole life." And I'm like, okay, Paul didn't want a thorn in his flesh his whole life, right? Like, if that's what God has allotted for you, right? If that's the way that he's going to draw you to him, who are you to say, no, right? Now, I go through ways in the book, like Like, you need to exercise, right? You need to be in community. You need to be serving others. You need to be eating right. I lost 70 pounds last year because everything was right in my life. Because I talk about mental health as a three-legged stool: brain, body, and spirit. So brain, I was taking my medication. Spirit was really plugged in, read New Morning Mercies every morning, Charles Spurgeon morning and evening every morning. And yet I started feeling a decline again. Well, I'm 70 pounds overweight. And that has physical, your physical life affects your mental health, right? So all that to say, you have to be in alignment on all of those, right? And so I tell people, like, I can't, if my anxiety on a normal day without medication is an 8, there's no way I'm going to be able to address spiritual issues, physical issues with my anxiety at an 8. It's like, it's like I see a bird and I'm like, is this the end of the world? And so my medication brings my anxiety from an 8 down to a 4. And at a 4, I can do the work. I can work out, right? I can eat better. I can do the studies, right, in the word that really help me. So that would be the first truth. Medication is okay. It's a common grace. And so I go through all these 14, and I won't go through all of them here, but the other thing I would tell people is your struggles don't just affect you, right? And so the kind of breakout star of the book in the workbook has been a chapter I wrote for loved ones of people who struggle, to understand what's going on inside of us as a sufferer, what to say, what not to say. There's a table in there, right? But I think a lot of times we as the sufferer say, I want to be heard, right? I wrote a chapter in a prescription for the church, how the church can be better, how they can listen to us better, right? That's all great, right? But your wife, your friend, your spouse, your mom, your dad, like your kids, they deserve to be heard too. And if you think back to my story, what I said earlier is, it wasn't until I finally listened to my wife, who was broken down in front of me, right? Who was crying and saying, I can't live like this. Did it kind of make me, wake up? And so I would tell people, listen, you as a loved one deserve to be heard. You also need to get help, right? During COVID, wrote the book during COVID. My wife and I were walking around the block for the 75th time one afternoon, because what else did you do, And she read the first draft of the manuscript, and I said, hey, is there anything that I haven't included that you think I should? You've lived this with me. She goes, tell them to get counseling. I'm like, well, yeah, I talk about people getting counseling in the book. She goes, no. Tell the loved ones to get counseling. And I'm like, oh, tell me more. Fast forward, like my wife every once in a while has to go back to counseling just to remind herself, how to love me, right? Because it can be hard at times, right? Listen, I talk about this as an ongoing battle, which is the truth I'm going to talk about next, right? And so she said, tell them to get counseling. And so I expanded that chapter all about how friends and family, this affects you as well, right? And you deserve to be heard. You need to go to counseling. You need to invest in yourself. And so then the final truth is that I'll talk about now is, this is an ongoing battle, right? I'm not who I was yesterday. I'm not who I'm going to be tomorrow, right? It's the whole idea of sanctification. And there's a sanctification process that is happening in my mental health, right? And, 5 years ago, I'm not, I'm handling stuff way better than I was 5 years ago. And I'm not handling it as well as I will 5 years from now, right? There are peaks and valleys, right? I had a depressive episode right after the book came out in the winter of 21. And I had another depressive episode this past winter, right? I'm the guy that wrote the book on mental health, right? Like, how am I still suffering? And then what I had to do is I had to go back and read my own book, right? And it's like, no, this is an ongoing battle. It is okay. You got to take the long view of this, right? And so now it's like, do I still have some depressive episodes? Yeah, but guess what? They don't last as long. Do I still have anxious thought cycles? Yeah, but instead of ruining a weekend, maybe I'm a little curmudgeon for an hour, right? But I can tell you that 10 years ago, my wife would have given, an arm and a leg for me to only be thinking about something for an hour, right? So listen, it is an ongoing battle. I said, I pray that Jesus will take away this from me. He hasn't. So then what? Well, I'm going to keep fighting, right? We were given the armor of God. Everyone knows the armor of God, right? And you're not given armor for one battle, right? Like you clean that armor, you shine that armor up, you polish it, you fix it. The assumption is that we're going to be in many battles, right? And, Jesus even left us by saying, in this world, you will have trouble, right? And so I think that the comfort I try to give people is just because you have another episode, just because you struggle, that doesn't mean that God is not still working. It doesn't mean that you're not still growing.
Gosh, that's good. Well, how can somebody, I know Amazon, but is there a better place or one you prefer them to connect with you, to hear more of your story, to get the book, to grab the companion guide, to ask any questions about, your creative company? What's a good place, John?
The best place to go is findrestnow.com, findrestnow.com. And so that is kind of the hub for, if you want to get the book, the workbook. I have a course that recently came out on this subject that's based off the book and the workbook. The cool thing also about the workbook too is when you buy the workbook, there are QR codes inside. And so that takes you to a special intimate video with you or with me, sharing with you just some insights, some ideas, some fresh perspectives. And so videos are a part of even just the workbook. So, as a digital creator, right, that's something that's helpful these days. And so it allows people to connect with me on that level. So findrestnow.com.
Perfect. And what about the creative company?
So that there's a link on there, but it's the Veritas Creative. So you can go to theveritascreative.com. And so what I do there is I take my years in the news business and digital media and running social media for some big names. And, I just help people create, right? Tell their story, right? And so sometimes I'm a director, right? I'm directing films. Sometimes I'm a ghostwriter. I just finished ghostwriting another book for someone else and helping them out there. So we just do it. People are like, so what do you do? I'm like, well, what do you need?
Yeah, perfect.
Start the conversation there. So
awesome. John, that was super helpful. I'm encouraging people to grab the book and the companion guide. Thank you for being honest and authentic and really openly sharing, because sometimes that's one of the most helpful super first steps.
Thank you for doing the same, and thank you for just being willing to have this conversation. I talk about in the chapter of Prescription for the Church, we have to be willing to have this conversation, right? Charles Spurgeon, the Prince of Preachers, suffered from depression. He called it melancholy, and he counseled young preachers on how to deal with their melancholy, right? So if the Prince of Preachers can have depression, guess what? Bob in the back pew, he's probably struggling with something too. And I'll leave with this, that whole idea of the proper theology of suffering. It's what I love about this book and the workbook. It's not just for your mental health, right? Like there are, if you're struggling with a broken marriage or wayward children, that proper theology of suffering is for all of that, right?
Oh, for sure.
So I'd even encourage you to pick it up, even if you're not struggling with just mental health.
Yeah. John, thank you. Man, we'll look forward to following you and all that the Lord's going to be doing through you. So I appreciate the time today.
Thank you, Josh, Mike.
Thank you for joining us on this latest edition to the Storyfield podcast. We hope that you have been challenged, inspired, and ready to take that next step, whatever that is. If you know someone with an amazing story that needs to be heard, send us an email at info@thestoryfield.com. Have a fantastic day, and we can't wait for you to join us on the next episode of The Storyfield.